Hello. Today I want to show an alternative to the average true range calculation. If you're not familiar with average true range, there's plenty of documentation on the internet. This is a copy of the page from Investopedia. It describes somewhere below the formula for average true range. What's important is this indicator was developed by J. Wells Wilder. It was developed in 1978, but it was intended for use on a daily chart to determine how far prices can be expected to move in a single day. But think about how well that translates when you apply this to intraday trading, say a 4-hour or a 1-hour chart, whether the average of the previous 14, which is the default number, whether the average of the previous 14 bars is really applicable to what you're using the ATR for. So I've just taken a snippet of a chart here. This is a 4-hour chart. And that means there are 6 bars per day. So if I wanted to calculate the average true range for that bar where the arrow has just appeared, so this is only a 4-period ATR, but I'm doing that just because it's easy to show on screen, then I would take the 4 bars that I'm showing here. But we can see that this bar where I'm trying to calculate the average has a much larger range than the 4 bars previously. The periodic ATR, on the other hand, would look backwards by 6 bars to begin with to the same time the day before, another 6 bars to the day before, and the day before. And you can see that the size of these bars I've highlighted are much closer to the average size matching this bar. This one here is smaller. I guess you can always expect variations. But in general, I would get a better average that matches where I can expect this bar to move by taking the same time each of the previous 4 days. Now this is only over an ATR 4, but if you're working on an hourly chart, an ATR 14 is going to show you some very small values if you include the Asian time frame, for example. So this is the indicator that we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to show you how to write it and how to use it. So this is the indicator that we'll be looking at today. This is the average periodic true range indicator. You can see in the bottom of the chart I have the average true range indicator here. And the difference between these two, the average true range, and this is for 14 periods on a 1-hour chart that I'm showing, this will show the average of the previous 14 hourly movements. But for intraday trading, each hour of the day has its own unique properties. Certainly during the Asian time frame, candles will be small. So if you're calculating the ATR on the beginning of the London session, for example, you'll be including a lot of averaging from bars during the Asian session that are really not relevant to that London session. The average periodic true range, on the other hand, takes the average of bars at the same time for the previous, in this case, 14 days. And you can see more consistency then on the bars at the same time in each day. So depending on what you're doing with your trading, this may be more useful to you in knowing how far a bar at a given time of day can be expected to move. So let's go to the code now and see how we write this. Now I have the editor open and I'm going to be writing this for MetaTrader 4 and 5. So my usual practice, I have an MQ4 file here that I'll be able to compile for MetaTrader 4, an MQ5 file for MetaTrader 5, and these two will contain code that's specific to MetaTrader 4 or 5, and then an MQH file where I'll put everything that I possibly can that could be common between the two. So just starting with the MQ4 file, standard property statements, copyright, link version, and property strict to conform to build 600 and above. Indicator separate window because the ATR does show in a separate window. And property indicator buffers. The ATR has only one value, so there's one indicator buffer. And then I'm just filling in the style, type, and color. And the syntax for that, property indicator underscore style 1 for the first line, and there is only one line. Type 1 and color 1. And I'm just making this a solid line, and I'm making this yellow by default, but you can change those in the inputs when you load the indicator. Here's the include statement for this MQH file that I'll be building out. And the specific code for MetaTrader 4, I'm putting this into a function called version init, so there'll be also a version init function in the MQ5 file. And there's only one thing that I need to do in MetaTrader 4 that is different between 4 and 5, and that's to set indicator buffers to 2. So although I've said here indicator buffers 1, in MetaTrader 4 that sets the number of buffers that will display on screen. But if I want to use additional buffers for working space, I have to use this indicator buffers statement to just increase that to 2. And I do have a second buffer for working space where I store the true range values for each candle. Go to the MetaTrader 5 version. Still has copyright link and version, but there's no need for property strict. It's harmless if you put it there, but I haven't used it here. Here though, still indicate a separate window. Indicator buffers I am setting to 2. So in MetaTrader 5 you actually declare the total number of buffers here and then use indicator plots to determine how many are going to appear on screen. And then style, type and color are the same. The same include statement for aptr.mqh. And then in version init, because I don't need to increase the buffers, there's actually nothing specific that I need for MT5 here. Although when we get to the MQH file, there are some statements that I'll be inserting that are needed by MT5 that are just going to be ignored by MT4. And now the MQH file. I've duplicated the copyright link and version statements here, although they're generally not used in the MQH file. I've also added the property strict. It will be ignored by MT5, but it will be used by MT4. So now I'll just remove this to give a little bit more space as we write the code. And the first things that I need will be some input statements. Now I have a line here for input shift, and that's equal to 1. With a typical ATR or the standard ATR, we can simply begin from bar number 1. But when I'm working with the periodic ATR, the first bar that I'm looking at is not bar number 1, it's 1 day earlier. So rather than have you do the math of how many bars that is backwards, I'm simply adding this one input that I'm calling shift, and that will be effectively 1 day backwards. So what I'm saying here is that this periodic ATR is going to be calculated beginning 1 day behind. And then the standard averaging period, I'm leaving that as the default of 14. So this will calculate the average of the true range of a bar at the same time each day for the past 14 days. And now I have 2 buffers. The second buffer here, buffer true range, that's where I'm going to store the actual true range value from each bar. And then the average periodic true range is the one that will be displayed on screen, and that will be the average calculated based on the values in the buffer TR. And now onto the onInit function. Here is where I'm going to call the specific initialization required for MT4 and 5. And because I've used the same function name in both the MQ5 and MQ4 files, I simply call that function here. And remember that in the MQ5 file there was nothing there. So this function will simply return back to the onInit. And so now I'm setting the number of digits on the indicator, and I'm setting that to the same number of digits that are applicable to the currency showing on screen, or the symbol showing on screen, and that's with the digits function. So by calling indicator set integer and using the indicator underscore digits and then passing this digits function, I'm saying that for my true range indicator, I'm going to show the same number of digits that that symbol is showing in the price section on the screen. So this statement is needed for MQL5, not needed for MQL4, but it's harmless to apply. In MQL4, these buffers that I declared are naturally defined as a series, meaning that index number 0 on the buffer matches with bar number 0 or the current bar on screen. In MetaTrader 5, they're not automatically set as a series, and that would mean that I would need to calculate which bar number matches which index number of the buffer. So it's much easier to just set them as a series, so I just do that once here. It doesn't hurt to do that for MQL4 because that is already true, but I'll just leave that in there for both. As I said, I'll put as much into the MQH file as I possibly can that can be common or at least have no impact between both MQL5 and MQL4. And I do the same for the buffer TR. And And now I just assign the buffers. So I'm assigning buffer APTR, which is the buffer that will actually store the values I want to display on screen, and I'm assigning that to index number 0. And there is only one displayed buffer on screen. And then I assign index number 1 to the buffer TR. So by doing these, MetaTrader knows that these are buffers associated with the index. It will automatically match them up with the bar numbers on the screen. As new candles are created, these buffers will automatically be adjusted to accommodate the new places for those new candles, and they will automatically match to candles on screen because I've used the array setter series here. Index number 1 is just value number 1, but I'm not displaying that on screen. And now if you look at that indicator on screen, there is usually a name in the top left corner. I'm just setting up that name using the string format. I'm calling it APTR, and I'm going to insert the two values here, which are the period and the shift. And then I simply assign that name to the indicator using indicator set string, indicator short name, and passing that name. And then in the data window, I want to actually display a name as well next to the value. So I haven't compiled that indicator yet, but I've just loaded the standard ATR. So here is the name that appears on the indicator. And in the data window, there is also a name that appears next to the value. So this indicator set string sets the name that appears on the chart, and plot index set string sets the name that will appear in the data window. And then I just return init succeeded. And now there's just the onCalculate function to write. And here is where I calculate how many bars need to be recalculated. So every time we call onCalculate, rates total tells me how many total candles or bars there are available. Prev calculated tells me how many of those I have previously calculated. If you reach a point on the indicator where, if you reach a point where your setting for total number of bars on the chart in MetaTrader is exceeded, MetaTrader will drop bars off, and then it will automatically recalculate these two so that they match. But the difference between these two, between rates total and prev calculated, tells me how many bars are available that I have not previously processed. So that's where I'm calculating this limit, rates total minus prev calculated. So that tells me how many. So that tells me how many bars I need to process, and it just avoids having to process the entire array every time. But this statement, if prev calculated is greater than 0, means that I've been through here at least once, and I'm just incrementing the limit by 1 with limit plus plus, and that forces bar number 0 to be recalculated each time because the value in there is going to be changing as the price changes. Now, this is only needed for MetaTrader 5, but it's harmless for MetaTrader 4. And for the same reason that the buffers earlier had to be set as series, I have to reassign some of the buffers passed into the onCalculate function as series so that I can again refer to those using element number 0 or index number 0 of those arrays, matching with bar number 0 on the chart. So the arrays that I'm going to be using are the close, the high, and the low, because they're the three values that are used in the true range calculation. Now, I'm calculating this multiplier value. This is because I need to know how many bars to go back to find the same time frame bar the day before. And the calculation is simple. There's a period seconds function which tells me how many seconds are in a given period. And because I'm looking at a daily chart, I'm calling period seconds period underscore D1. Now I could have inserted a constant here because that obviously doesn't change, but I'm just doing it this way because if you want to modify this later and change this D1 to something else, then this will still work. So total number of seconds in a day divided by the same period seconds for the current chart period, and that will tell me how many current chart bars are in a single day. And now a loop where I'm going to go through and calculate the true range on the bars that haven't previously been calculated. So this is why I'm starting with limit -1, as long as I is greater than or equal to 0 and I minus. So if you think about the index number into the array as matching the bars on the chart, I'm counting from left to right, beginning with the first bar that has not been calculated. So firstly, I'm initializing the true range buffer. And then if I is less than rates total -1. So the true range calculation uses the bar before the current bar to get a close price as the start of the true range max min. And so I need the number of bars available to be at least one more than the number of bars that I'm trying to look at. So this is why I have this one check if I is less than rates total -1. Otherwise I'll get an array index out of range. I'm simply saying buffer true range I is equal to the maximum of high for the bar I'm calculating and close for the previous bar, so close I plus 1. So it's the maximum of the high or the previous close minus the minimum of the current low or the previous close. So that takes me from the highest value to the lowest value based on the high, previous close and low. And that's the standard formula for the true range calculation. Now, I also have a true range total. So this has calculated the value for that single bar. Now I need to calculate the average for the previous average number that I'm going to be looking at. And so I'm starting with a total because it's a simple average. All I need to know is the total and then the number of bars, and I just divide. And so now I have another loop inside here. For the standard average true range, because I'm just looking at the consecutive bars, I don't need to do this, but because I'm looking at a periodic, I need to insert this extra loop because I'm going to be jumping by a number of bars backwards. And this is a simple loop for j equals 0, as long as j is less than the input period and j++. So I'm using the default 14 periods. This will loop through this 14 times. So first I need the bar number that I'm looking at, and that is I, which is the bar in the outer loop, plus the multiplier, which is number of bars to step back for a single day, multiplied by j, how far I am through the inner loop, plus the input shift. So my standard shift is 1, being 1 day. So on the first iteration through this, j is equal to 0. J plus the input shift is 1. 1 day multiplied by number of bars in a day, plus I will give me the same bar 1 day earlier. And then I have the same test here. As long as bar is less than rates total -1, then true range total plus equals the buffer true range for the bar. So I'm just adding all of those true range values. And once I've calculated that total, I can just say buffer for the average periodic true range for I is equal to the true range total divided by the input period. So total divided by 14. Now, to the very left of the chart, because I'm simply ignoring anything if bar is less than rates total -1, then you may not get 14 values in here, but in most cases that number would be so far back in your chart that you're not going to be too worried about it. If you really wanted to, you could add another counter here and then divide by that counter, but I think that's a trivial exercise and not really worth worrying about. And then returning rates total simply says I've now calculated everything up to the total number of rates available, so that next time we come into this loop, that value will be in prev calculated, and then when I go into this calculation, rates total is equal to prev calculated, limit will be 0 here, prev calculated greater than 0, I'll just add 1, and that will just mean that I recalculate bar number 0 each time. And that's it. It's as simple as that. All I really have to do, calculate the true range, which is a very simple standard calculation, and then install this loop to calculate the total of bars separated by 1 day. Now, there is a small drawback to this. If for some reason a bar is missing, then this will not necessarily give the correct result. And that may happen if you're looking at the very small time frames, like 1 minute. But if you're looking at something larger than that, it's very unusual to have a bar missing. So this is easy enough. If you really wanted to cater for possible missing bars, then you would need to insert extra code here that actually checks the time of that bar. And then we also need to decide what to do if there is a bar missing. Do you take the bar before, the bar after? Do you simply skip? So I haven't included any of that logic here. If you're really interested in that, leave a comment and I'll see if I can do a follow-up for that. But I'm just going to assume that bars always exist and I just step backwards by count. So let me just recompile the MetaTrader 4 version, make sure I haven't made any typing errors. That compiled. I'll have to switch to the MetaTrader 5 editor to compile the MQ5 version. So I'm in the MetaTrader 5 editor now. I've opened the aptr.mq5 file, compile that, and that compiles. Let's just go to the chart and see how that looks. Now I've started just by adding the standard ATR here, ATR 14, and you can see a reasonably smooth curve. And now I've added the average periodic true range, 14,1, so still using 14 periods, looking the first bar being 1 day backwards. And you can see it's much more jagged. But if I line up the crosshairs here, that peak is at 1700 on the 11th of August. If I find a peak here, that's also at 1700 on the 10th of August. This peak is at 1700 on the 9th of August. So you can see the pattern repeating day after day. So I feel that in the right circumstances, depending on your strategy, it can be much more useful to have an idea of the expected true range for each time of the day. So these values on the standard true range are more reflective of what has happened in the 14 periods before, rather than what typically happens in that bar each day. Next week, I will be further modifying the toolbox to make Expert Advisor code more common between MetaTrader 4 and MetaTrader 5. I'm not trying to make them the same, I'm just trying to eliminate the code that I would have to write differently for MetaTrader 4 and 5 by putting them into common libraries. So I'm doing that ahead of another Expert Advisor that I'm going to be writing the following week. So if you found this useful, then please click the like button. If you want to see that video and any of our other videos, click subscribe, and then if you click the bell icon, you'll be notified when we do release a new video. So until the next time, thank you for watching.